This is the site, the Montgomery Place in the Hudson Valley. It's part of Bard College. It's a 320 acre. Can we get the next slide?
Mm-hmm. This is zooming in. Just zooming in.
And it's protected by Scenic Hudson. It's a landmarked estate by a great architect. The house was by Alexander Jackson Davis. The landscape by Andrew Jackson Downing, a very famous landscape architect who was actually introduced the competition for Central Park. So this is back in the 1850s. And so this is a historic site, and Bard College owns it, and they manage it, and they want to build a building for the Bard Prison Initiative. The Bard Prison Initiative, it's called BPI, is a organization that there's a film, a wonderful film by Ken Burns that tells the story. This has been going on for 15 years now, 10 years, 15 years. And basically it goes into the jails in the region and gives a chance prisoners can get an education and come out with a degree. So connecting the wires of Bard College so this is the Bard Prison Initiative, but they only need 5,000 square feet of offices. So Leon Botstein and myself, we dreamed up, by the way, they don't know about this, that we're doing this as a student exercise. So please don't, if anybody knows them, don't say anything. We're gonna show them afterwards. We're gonna make a pamphlet and a booklet so that we can organize ourselves. And he realizes that because this might be the only time he can ever build a building on this site, the rest of it has to remain a preserve. So zoom in. And the strategy is to displace this terrible little building, a visitor center built by Beyer Blinder Bell in the 80s, tear it down, which nobody is going to complain about. All the other buildings are historic from the 1850s. Tear that down and put a new pavilion there, which will be 12,000 square feet, the experimental pavilion, and to have, I call it a transformation of consciousness pavilion. So somehow to make this little piece of architecture, okay, house the 5,000 square feet of the Bard Prison Initiative, which are basically offices, but then exhibition space, connect to nature, whatever the imagination of the students are. So they're all 12,000 square feet. They all have to be sited basically on the footprint of, or nearby the footprint of this existing building. And there's the old 1850s A.J. Davis Mansion, which is now open for weddings and visits. The site is open now, even though COVID. They don't have any programs in the mansion, but because it's a park, they've opened it. And I think it's a wonderful Hudson River Valley. You know, the landscape views are like the great Hudson Valley painters. You see the river there, and I think some of the students connect to this. And there's the ugly little building. We're getting rid of it, and that's basically the site. There's a lot of trees. There's a gravel parking lot that we have to keep. That's the only place that visitors can park on the 320 acres. It's a gravel road or gravel parking lot. And there's a little video showing you how to get into the site. So why don't we start with there's Eric. We can see Eric now.
Yes,
okay.
and we can also see Leah Kelly, who's a neuroscientist, Martin Strichgard, who is an architect and educator, a colleague from the Spitzer School, and Ashley Simons, also a writer who has also met the residents before. So we'll try to stay with 5-minute presentation, 15-minute discussion. Give me 1 second to pull up Renan's presentation. Renan?
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, so the title is Project No 14. This is the 14th architecture project I've worked on in my life. And I was looking at different types of networks in different scales, the urban scale of Casbah in Algiers and the scale of the brain, the neural imaging, and Thomas Saraceno's installations of webs in between trees. And the diagram you see on the left is a diagram by Yannis Xenakis, who's a composer, and it's a suggestion of a distribution of musicians amongst the audience. So it's decentralizing the typical hierarchy of musical scene. So the theme is perceptual disturbance and mutilation. And I think transformation of consciousness could happen through these, the juxtaposition of these two and rhythm. So I think that this disjunctive proximity of these two allows us to dislocate someone's perception. And I think both disturbance and meditation are good in this case. The sketch on the upper left is one of the initial sketches. It's about walking through density and arriving at these relief moments of open spaces, and a diagram of that right below. And what you see on the upper right is a little bit of local history. It's from 1800s and near Glen Falls in Hudson River. So they used to have log booms to either carry or gather timber or to block ships from passing. And below there's a drawing of that I did. So this is a study of how the log boom drawing could be interpreted. And on the upper left, you see that as a paver in glass. And below you see that as a extrusion of walls and also as a thin structural extrusion. And on the lower right, you see that because the forest-like quality of the previous images and sketches made me think of engaging the network of trees, I decided to incorporate this network to the network of the trees. So here you see that same thing as a circulation idea, and on the lower left, it is as screens of facade or apertures on the facade. And here's a light study of that. Lebbeus Wood said the more the brain is stimulated, the more it gets to work. So, and he says that light is a way to do that. So light is important in this project. Here are the different types of light qualities I've been looking at. First, it's a dappled light that comes from the trees on the side. And above, upper left is an artificial imitation of it. And lower right corner, you see what I call the waterfall of light, which is a more open source for light, like more bigger aperture in contrast to the other type. Here's a study of dappled light on architecture. Here's Anthony Braxton, another composer who I've been looking at, and he, instead of naming his compositions, he put visual titles, and his compositions only had like numbers. That's why I also titled my project like this. And I started to study these diagrams. Here's the one that I looked at and interpreted as light and a language of surfaces and how that could be within the trees. And here's a study of light and planes study model. Another diagram by Braxton on the upper left, it's, to me, that's about, it's a graphical notation, but to me, that's about changing the ground level in section. So I started to work on that. And upper right corner, there's the idea of what's below your feet and what's above your head. So what if we start to switch which one is natural and which one's artificial? What would that do to you? The question of that. And here's a section combining the planar language and the light studies, light qualities. And this is a study of volumes inspired by Braxton's. And here's volumes and planar language all coming together.
He keeps sketching.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and now all these three starts to come together. The log boom network, the circulation, and the planar language with the light. And here, upper right corner is a photo I took. So the difference here is that in the upper right, the architecture has a regular rhythm and the trees have an irregular rhythm. And on the lower right, it's the vice versa. And the lower right is Dia Beacon Garden. And so that's why I decided to have some, almost like a Beaux-Arts kind of move, to have these trees on the upper right corner when you arrive with cars. So you would see all these orderedness. And then when you arrive to the site and to the building, you start to, everything starts to entangle and all the irregularity there. So the next 5 slides, you can move quickly. It's a different light on different times of the day. There's 3 more.
Nice.
Cool man's
Came
animation.
a long way in 4 days.
And this is the ground floor. So you can see the network of stairs. You can see the red dashed lines, which show the volumes above. And the spaces below volumes that we see here are for classrooms and exhibition spaces. And the zigzag line that you see sometimes next to the walls, those are for, as a suggestion of closure with glass during different times of the year. And those crazy thin lines are pavers, and some of them turn into walls, and some of them turn into thin column structures. And that lower middle space is for exhibition. And now, yeah, you can see how it relates to the network of the trees. And this is 2nd floor. I'm missing the 1st floor plan, but this above floors are for office spaces. And the next one would be, again, relationship trees. I also plant some trees, by the way, in the site. I don't know if I mentioned that, but within the structures. This is the elevation. You can start to see that the architecture is disappearing most of the times. Section. This is through the volumes. It's an unrolled section, and it's showing how all these volumes connect from above, and always some part touches the ground. And these are how the interiors of these volumes would look like.
Great progress. Man, you really changed. I have to explain to everybody that this is a summer program that only is 3.5 weeks. And we had a midterm on the 21st. And he had a box. He had literally a Miesian box. And I said to him, I said, please take a look at that log boom, that incredible photograph. And this was like the 21st of July. I said, take a look at that log boom. You found that. I've never seen that before. It's absolutely brilliant. Why don't you just make that log boom your plan? And I'm surprised that you could do it. I thought you were not capable. I'm totally amazed at this project. 4 days.
Amazing.
Do you have the image of where you were on the 21st? Could you just show? I think people won't appreciate it. You don't happen to have that image handy, do you?
I mean, you're sharing screen, so maybe you can, or maybe I can.
Oh, that's all right. That's right. We're talking about this design, but just, how do you feel? You've changed, you know? It's like almost like a sex change or something, right?
Yeah, I think I was really nervous.
Is that an asset? Is that an asset or a liability?
I don't know.
It's your critique. Is he done, or can we ask him some
Yeah,
stuff?
no, he's done.
Yeah, I'm done. Yeah.
Okay. So let me make a point or two, if you don't mind. it's hard to evaluate this without you telling us, so please tell us, what does a transformation of consciousness mean? So if I looked at this and I said, you got it, or you missed it, how do you evaluate this in terms of the change of consciousness state? I mean, are you going from conventionally conscious about pragmatic issues to some kind of ethereal, transcendental state? I mean, you're taking us from somewhere to somewhere. So it's not so much the sensibility, which Stephen seems to like, it's the conceptual side, the intellectual side. How are you taking me from somewhere to somewhere? Am I better off when I arrive, or was I better off when I started?
Okay.
Where'd you take me?
So I don't know if you're better off after this experience, but I think it's supposed to disturb you in some ways, not in a bad way, but so the contrast and the proximity of these different qualities of light and scale, I think both start to play with your mind and your body at the same time. So when you go through this different things, you start to realize different things, and your sensual perception is amplified, and what you think is also, I think.
I mean, my response to that is, it's vague. And if we were trying, for instance, you have a perforated wall, and there are a lot of slots in the wall, which presumably are an analog to the logs floating down the river. The logs floating down the river have a visual association. They also have to do with some lumberjacks coming into the forest and knocking the forest down. So that could be understood as a pejorative. And that's another discussion. We probably won't get to all of this, but there are three flavors of trees. There's flavor number one, which is the cut trees in the river. There's flavor number two, which is the existing trees. The flavor number three, which is the new trees, and how those three associate might be part of an argument. I think what I'm saying is it's missing a conceptual argument. If I said to you,
Eric, you're missing the Anthony Braxton. You're missing the fact that it's not a linear process. He's mixed in this jazz composer, Anthony Braxton. Could we go to those diagrams? Mm-hmm. And he's bringing these two forces together. And I think one of the things about, we don't know what a transformation of consciousness is. I take responsibility for putting such a big word on top of their pavilion, but I think listening to the jazz of Anthony Braxton does give you a transforming experience, listening to fantastic jazz music. And the fact that Braxton then, makes these little diagrams instead of words. I think that he discovered that, by the way. He's in Istanbul, Turkey, right? So, I mean, it's pretty wild that we can bring, 5 students together, and this guy discovers a jazz musician that I never heard of. And then I was the guy is still alive. He's an amazing figure. And I love these little pink and green and yellow strange diagrams. So I think we have to look at it as bringing that to bear together with the log boom. It's not one.
Yeah, I understand that. That's not the intersection of multiple components.
Yes.
We get all of that. The question is whether, in making a demand of the student to be accountable, if you said the little diagrams are pretty, or they're intriguing, or they're cute, or they're enigmatic, there are lots of things. And we could spend, there's so much material here for 3 weeks, it's astonishing.
Right.
We can't go through all of it. I mean, it's too much stuff. And we got 5 minutes. But what I'm interested in is the rigor of the discourse just for the hell of it. So if you say, jazz is intuitive, jazz is an instinct.
Uh-oh, we lost him.
We will be right back. We should be right back in a second. If not, we have to.
There a way, since we decided to have a discussion today. So the discussion is about the content of what he put on the wall. And if you just want to say that by instinct or by intuition, the amalgamation, all of these pieces has a lot of appeal, and by the way, it does. And by the way it's drawn and presented, which is unorthodox vis-a-vis the usual student, Zoom, jury you see, all of that I stipulate. So having said all of that, I'm asking whether the student could be more precise in accounting for, take the wall, for instance, the perforated wall. And if I said, I'm going to take a third of those slots down, does that matter? Would he quit, for instance? In other words, to what extent, when you say light, is light in a certain form or by a certain quantity or at a certain orientation, or more high, less in the middle, even less low, looking at constellations, light in, light out, all of that. I'm interested to hear a kind of intellectual exegesis of all, because he's got so much stuff flying around. And the question is, if we moved it or adjusted it, would he walk off the Zoom and hang up? How does
Can I kick in?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Maybe.
I think I'm in the same thing, but I have a little different attitude. When I look at this particular slide, you can already see a problematic in its literalness to the photograph of the log. Could you go back to the log photograph? Stephen, I just sent you a book of drawings. It's interested in willfulness and chance. So I'm gonna have a very particular kind of attitude towards this photograph, right? And it's gonna be a very interesting photograph to me. But I would think the student here, what he didn't do that you're discussing is make the connection between Braxton. It's funny, I just came off listening to On the Corner, which is Miles Davis' kind of most radical piece of music that would be parallel to some of the Braxton stuff.
Right.
But what you haven't done is made a connection between what in this photograph you're interested in. The sketch doesn't help. It's just a literal, it has no nuance. It has no kind of direction of what is it in this photograph. And is it the randomness, the chance behavior, the kind of idiosyncratic notion of this seen purely, let's say in a formal sense, not socially, environmentally, culturally. You guys talked about that. That'd be another discussion, which wouldn't be as interesting. And Braxton and those diagrams, because the diagrams are also very private and personal and useful to him. You're trying to connect up the two notions of the experimental music and this photograph, and it seems to be that's your next project as you leave this very quick kind of charrette. That if you're interested in this, that's going to lead you to some aspect of challenging architecture. I look at this, and to me, it's extremely kind of interesting, and I could use this. And I'm going to put it to work, but I'm going to have very specific notions of what aspect of this is going to have to do with changing an attitude towards organizational ideas of architecture, which I could anticipate are going to connect to your jazz, the jazz, and somehow, the sketches were kind of highly kind of traditional in its organization. They didn't have that sense at all. They were actually, I've never seen them. Again, I can't imagine a musician. They seem very incredibly kind of the diagrams. Yeah, they're somehow private to him. Ooh, the pink one's kind of cool. Anyway, but you're having trouble saying what things mean. What are the actual connections that allow you as an architect?
Right. I just want to say that, we have 5 projects. These students had never met me before, and I said, this is a challenging project. I made it challenging by putting the big words. I apologize to Eric Moss. Transformation of consciousness, that's my words. This should have been just called Pavilion at Montgomery Place.
Yes,
But I said what we're going to do with this studio is try to come up with what is the idea that drives the design. And I have to say that this young man, he went a light year in the last week. And if you could only see the boxes, the Miesian boxes that that he couldn't break out of. And I think it's just absolutely amazing. And he's the one that discovered Anthony Braxton. He brought that to the table. He brought the log booms to the table. So the point being, when you're doing a 12,000 square foot pavilion, you don't have a language of your own. You know, Tom Main could do this building, you know, without even thinking, because he's got a language. So could Eric. These kids they don't have a language. They're just starting out. So the question is, what's the idea that drives the design? So let's move to the next one. Maybe it'll get clearer that we're all trying to do a 12,000 square foot pavilion on this kind of historic garden site. I mean, in a way, it's probably too much to try to do in 3 weeks.
I think it will be helpful.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Franklin, and this is my project. I title it Light Weaves the Horizon, Sequence Weaves the Arts. Next, please. So I started off, the idea was the weaving of the arts in the sequence, how the discipline of art has no boundary, no definitive definition to what is a painting, a sculpture. So the knitting of all art disciplines together can strengthen one another. So how maybe the exhibit and sequence can become one. Next. And those are study models of that idea. And then the next idea I was exploring was the twilight rays. So in the site, there's a long history connecting to the Hudson Valley Painting School, which started that art movement in America. And the first painting that established this movement was called The Oxbow by Thomas Cole, depicting the passing of a storm over the Connecticut Valley, which shows on the upper left, the massive rain clouds with the twilight rays breaking through. And this type of light is very native to the Hudson Valley, which I began questioning, how can light provide shape, provide space and light into the space, and how space can be woven by light. Next. And then this is another early study model of that idea of the way light changes throughout the passing of the day. Next. And then this is the site plan and relationship to the trees and all this, the entry of the path. Next. And then in this axon, the idea of weaving is manifested through the walls and light. The walls is not thought of as a four-sided container, but rather to guide our gaze. There's no clear front to the space, so one can weave through multiple entries that were created, and every visit to the space will be different depending on the time of the day and the path you choose. And by guiding our gaze and weaving into the landscape with the walls, one is always simultaneously part of multiple spaces, and also simultaneously inside and outside. Next. And this is just the plan and the sections, which I, in the next following pages, I did a series of section models showing the idea of the weaving of the light. Next. And then this is how the reading of the space changes throughout the passing of the day, how at certain times varies. So the cloud, or I guess the roof, they all open up to all four directions. So then it allows light to seep into the space, and space is woven by light. So there's different times of day, different degrees of light enters the space, and then that changes. Next. And this is another section. And then in the next page, I show how the space reads differently. You read this image from left to right. So the passing of the day from morning to noon, how the space and the way light enters changes drastically. And then here I was showing what is it like to be underneath that space, which is what is it like to be underneath the clouds, which is the roof, and how our transparency is always challenged, and we're always both inside and outside. And that's my final slide.
Kompish, what does it look like from Monaco?
Franklin, I have a couple of questions. I like your light studies and presentational approach here. If you could say a few things about program, and not so unlike the first presentation, that like was kind of somewhat in a productive way caught up in consciousness, the one or the other, what would it be for you, in terms of in terms of thinking? How do you change yourself, or how do you change anybody that visits what you're proposing as a pavilion, as a project, and how it relates to again, I guess like program is the one thing I would like to know a little bit more about. Other than it being an interesting space, right? Like that, like does something, but like what does it do for what you imagine to propose? If this makes sense.
Yeah. So, the two main program was the office and the art exhibit, and the office, I kind of treated it as a flexible space where, if during certain times it would have to be used, but then I was thinking, what if like in 10 years that kind of space is no longer needed, and that can be kind of converted into an exhibition space, which I placed like a service core in the plan, but I didn't. And there's like second floors that do house the office, but then I didn't show that only because that was not something I was trying to underscore in the presentation. But yeah, I saw that as something that if I had more time to tweak, I can definitely kind of fit the program into it. But I was always treating it as I was doing the project.
You know,
as
it's not to interrupt you, but like it's what's interesting here is like if I look at all those slides and the kind of enthusiasm you put into how to deal with light and the roof, if you would start to do the same with the wall, and if you would start to think about office, not necessarily just needing to be something that's within your building, but like possibly also like around and like outside of it, which probably would be a little bit more accurate these days, where more people would want to live and work outside rather than like inside. I think you would start to also question program through building and form. This is something I'm super interested in right now, whereas we had to fight like the last couple of years in arguing for any kind of form move anybody made, because it was all always driven by program. Now all of a sudden, like the kind of the staircases, the lobbies, the cracks, like the walls, like all of those things that like are too often deemed as like too formal and too unnecessary become like super interesting, because those are the places where you can like hide for a phone call or distance from whatever you want to be like not close to. So I guess the way you position the building, what you do with your walls and what you do with the roof in terms of like bringing in light is one thing, but the way you kind of start to almost like dissolve your boundary, your barrier, and like to a certain degree engage landscape in a formal way rather than just a kind of ecological one.
Keep this slide on. But given, my question would be probably directed towards your conversation with Stephen, because I look at this and I drew a minute ago, is this, it's so connected to history, whether it's Farnsworth or Barcelona, and you would discuss kind of what's taken place in the last half a century. Blow it up a little bit. I need to see this piece over here. No, the other way, down. Yeah, or is it closer to the case study when you're discussing the case study house in California, when you're looking at landscape and the relation of building, because then in that case, we already know that this piece is here and it's that thick, right? And it's all of a sudden, that's maybe not there because these now have kind of a role in kind of connecting, right? And it seems like it's funny in your project because it has such strong characteristics to work that we're highly aware of, that it would be kind of an attack mechanism, or you're going to look at this now and give it a critique that's going to take it someplace, right? That's going to have to do with what's taken place in the last half a century plus, right? For me, and it'd be the beginning conversation before, to me, the lighting is, again, it would be secondary still, that you have a kind of basic, broad organizational site strategy. And again, I think Stephen presented the project, I thought is one of the primary ideas was building landscape and the value of the site. I've happened to know the site, and it's an incredibly, you guys, I guess, were visiting the site too, right? Yeah, it's an incredible site. And it does seem like this has, again, a historical kind of connection to that, a way of treating that, right? Having to do with the complete breaking down of edge, right? Of this thing, right? And this kind of these lines as they extend. And I sense we need another map. They're going to be broader. They're going to have, I can't, you've given me no information to see what the relationship of the building is, but and they're Cartesian. My guess is there's something to do that they're going to kind of push that right and make it have, need to go back to the lake and the piece and to see whether this has any broader, if you're going to stay with the strategy, this very literal kind of strategy, or whether it's going to take you someplace.
I think part of the problem is that when you talk about a conceptual strategy and whether the origin of the transformation and all of that phraseology is too esoteric or not really relevant, if there's a transition and the pieces are the pieces and the sensibility is prized, but on the other hand, there's some discipline to this or some demands that we make on the space. For instance, light is a virtue in both projects. Is dark a virtue? Or is the opposition of light to dark? And what does that mean? Because it might mean a hell of a lot if they threw Michael Cohn in a cell the other day and locked him in with no light, no air, no food. And that has a lot to do with his consciousness. And so the question is how to mitigate these features, I think, in pursuit of some kind of transformative objective, whether it's the landform or the water form or the building form. And the building form, I think in one way or another, Tom is getting to this. It's something we recognize, but more than that, it doesn't move you through a sequence of opportunities or transitions. It's not very variable. In other words, I think if you arrived at one end, you could hang a U and go home because you kind of know what's coming. And if that's the case, then there's a zone which is a transformative zone, and that's it, ipso facto, as opposed to a sequence. We're going to take you through, we're going to waterboard you, we're going to hang you, we're going to, whatever we're going to do, and it's an asset or it's a liability or it's from one to the other. So somehow the intellectual content of the thing doesn't correlate with the imagery. And that, I think that's the difficulty.
Yep. Franklin, what I would do, you've got, I'm looking at your section, you have your thing up here and you have the ground. I would automatically challenge that. Look at Stephen's project in DC. Your solution is going to, hang in there. I would start, that's the ground, number one. And that is a change that's radically taken place in the last half a century, that there's a complete different thinking of the status of passive ground, active building. And then there's an alignment or a connection between new typologies where the whole notion of the singularity of site has been challenged. And in fact, it does this. That'd be the first. I would just literally even take the thing you have and just do this and see what it does.
I understand, Tom. Tom, did you just flip and you said the section is the plan? So you took the plan, flipped it 90 degrees and said the plan becomes a section. Is that what you said?
That, and I've cut it in half. Just half of it's underground. I think that this notion of the passivity to begin with, I think would be the first change. Stephen, did it come up with your project in DC? Because you're a guy that we both share that, right? That today the ground is an active ingredient and we have a complete different notion towards the relationship of site.
Right.
Site is
That would be a
manipulated.
possibility on this site as well.
I mean, I think, Franklin, it's really interesting to see the development in the project, and excuse me for the sirens in the background. And I agree with all of the observations, and I think, you know, one thing that you said was, you spoke about weaving as opposed to Renan speaking about networking. And two things struck me as being important. You mentioned the question of simultaneously recognizing that you're inside and outside, or simultaneously existing in multiple spaces. And I think if you take those two questions alone, just the sense that you're never in one place without being somewhere else. And if you interrogate the project based on those two parameters that you set, I think many of the questions that are being offered to you will be addressed. I love these models, by the way, particularly the top image. And, you know, I start to imagine rotating some of these models, because I think, you know, clearly the roof, quote unquote, is the most radical part of the structure. And I think very simply, if you rotated this 180 degrees, it would offer you certain ways of re-seeing the project. I think Tom was offering other ways by imagining the ground datum to be in a different place. So I think these models that you made are very, very beautiful. And I think if you just interrogated them more and reread them, I think they'll offer a lot of answers. The last thing I would say, I also like the sequence of the models, because what I think is important about your project, and Eric and Christoph spoke to this question of light and darkness. If you read the sequence of those images, right, the character of the space changes over time. So to me, your project would require a certain kind of patience. In other words, one would have to exist in this space for a long period of time, for hours on end, right, to really appreciate its power. And so I want to, you know, offer that to you. One last very quick thing, maybe about consciousness. You know, if we're trying to find definitions of consciousness, maybe a useful one of many, the neurophysicist Christoph Koch, you know, he defines consciousness as essentially integration and differentiation, and that consciousness is everywhere. A light switch is conscious, human is conscious. Difference is that the consciousness within the human mind is far more complex than that in a light switch, or even in a supercomputer. So to the extent that maybe the projects can point out degrees of integration and degrees of distinction, you know, we'll get at specific notions of consciousness that each student is trying to deal with. Anyway.
One addition to that, one additional point is this, as you refer to the models, if you shove, the walls don't mean much, really. The walls just get you up to the roof, and the skylights, the apertures in the top dance. If you push the thing into the ground so that the wall of the building was a cut in the dirt or the granite, and the aperture was essentially in the plane of the earth. So you take the walls out of the discourse, which again give you the form of the space, but that's all.
Eric, we're working on the same project, dude. That's the ground there, right?
That's
Can you
right.
see my drawing?
There you go.
Yeah, okay. You know, if you'd have been, to me, if this had been a little more disciplined, I would want to keep this same photograph and look at what these guys are talking about. And my guess is you would reinvent this, and you might get rid of this, and you would really, I like Eric's notion of the more extreme, that it can go, if it's light, it goes dark, right? That you really use that as an idea. My guess is you would completely reinvent this. It'd be the focus, that desire would be the focus of an invention of this system that lets in light. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next one. We have 3 to do. This will be number 3.
Thank you.
Jessica?
Ooh.
Decayed hole among the mountains.
Hi everyone. The title of my project, A Decayed Hole Among the Mountains. And the title came from this draft of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And in the poem, or in the draft of the poem, there's a scene that has all these like visceral elements to it. So there's this rain, and there's this empty chapel, and there's birds. and there's a flash of lightning, and there was something about the scene, the quality of that scene, that I thought was a good starting point for thinking about the site. And at the same time, I was thinking about sacred spaces and thinking of perhaps what the most efficient kind of sacred of space that transform your consciousness, being that a sacred space, which is its entire intention. And so kind of breaking down the elements of what creates a sacred space and thinking of how they could be abstracted. And so one of the things I was really interested in, the top left, is this idea of the threshold and of the lintel, and seeing it as a moment in between one consciousness and the other, and likewise one world and another. Lintel also is a Latin root, limen, which is the changing physiologically and physically between spaces. So in the next sketch, I'm thinking about the threshold and the passageway, and thinking about how it interacts with the building, like in its adjacencies. Does it come right up close to it? Does it interfere? Does it become part of it? And then at the same time, thinking about the other species that inhabit buildings. And so on the bottom right image, it's a dove cote, and it's an ancient structure that's used to cultivate doves for many years. And this is usually built adjacent to a barn or a house. And then in the left example, you have Niemeyer's kind of like monumental structure called Pigeon for the People, where he creates housing structures within the vacancies, but kind of celebrates their existence. And then in the middle sketches, you have the Bat Tower, which is a project that helps to house bats that are endangered. And the way the human interacts with it is through the senses, not through the visual senses, but never through inhabiting them. And so here I'm kind of sketching how all of these notions come together, and at the same time thinking about this kind of like meandering path and this notion of nature, where nature is this place where you both go lose yourself and both go find yourself. And thinking of them as a kind of compound. So I found these drawings of the Mississippi River, and I really loved the natural meander of the river as a way of thinking about threshold in this non-linear way. On the next slide, I was doing studies on light. And I've been really interested in this idea of light being a kind of marking of time. So these images were taken from a stained glass window passing through different hours, so like 7 a.m., 8 a.m., 9 a.m., and 10 p.m. And the shadows that they casted, the light shadows that they casted, were these like kaleidoscopic markings of time, and thinking about time not in a mechanical or linear way, but as a more like haptic way, so like sensing the position of the sun in the sky or the length of a shadow. And so in the next image, it's like the same study of the same form, but at a different time, with a different shadow on it. And here in a diagram, I'm thinking of how to, recreate that in a different way that is not as literal as a stained glass window, but perhaps as this like panel that already has this slow gradation that would eventually fall through the surfaces of the building and create these castings of light. And here's a model of a part of the walkway that I designed. We'll probably understand it better when we get to the site plan. But essentially, I wanted to create a distinction between the parking lot and the existing building are so adjacent that through this choreographed notion and slowing the viewer down, you could, by the time you get to the building, have transcended a different state of consciousness. So here, I think there's a couple more photos of the model. And one of the reasons that I have two nested structures, maybe go back, yeah, two nested structures is this idea of like instability, and once again, like having this haptic element let you know what your surroundings are. So thinking of like an unsteady bridge and being tethered, and how in an unsteady bridge, if someone else is passing and you're passing, you'll feel that person. So by having this kind of like tethered structure, the flow would kind of fluctuate in a way that you would either know someone is coming, or you would feel your own gravity on the surface, so that the ground isn't always steady or straight. So here is the site plan, and you can kind of see the meandering structure, and essentially the meandering structure forks into 3 different paths. The path on the left goes to the nature hike. The path in the center goes into the building that just actually becomes the building, and the path on the right goes into this kind of path to nowhere that looks upon this pond that I landscaped onto the site, and into these totems of habitat that are to be looked at but not to be inhabited across the site. So I think yeah, a little bit more of a linear without the shadows. And then in the next slide, you have the section. So on the furthermost right, you have the parking lot, you have the world of like the everyday, and then you start ascending onto this platform that is tethered and suspended on another platform, and then there's these openings of light inspired by the natural dappling of the leaves, but usually the light is what's moving when you see the dappled effect, and in this case the humans are moving across the site and the dappled stays the same. So kind of like switching back these notions of what is moving and what is static. And as you proceed, the openings become more apparent, and there's more of them, and so there's more light. It's kind of like the start of tunnel, and it starts to reveal itself into the building that has a slanted first floor and has these spaces that are compressed and open. And then at the furthermost left, you'll find the road again, which is the service road. So it's kind of like a section in between both roads. And I believe the next ones are a couple, just more details because it's such a long section. And I think that's the last slide.
That's the last slide, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Can we see the plan of that arrangement? Because that's much more interesting than this straight.
It's an unfolded.
Well, that's very deceiving. The way you're presenting it, I think it's much stronger in reality than the way you're presenting it, because the plan shows it much more animated than that straight shot of that section, right?
Yeah, there was no way I could cut this section through it and show the path, so I unrolled it to show the length of it.
But where is that bridge in the plan?
It's the meandering path, yeah.
Right, so it's a little, yeah.
You're not showing it properly. The idea is much more interesting than your drawing. It's just not showing it.
Actually, cutting it straight would be far more beautiful, because you would actually see these episodic breaks and
Start and stop, yeah.
That would be better.
It's a representational question, Jessica. Really, really interesting project. And if we would be sitting at Columbia or anywhere in the studio right now, I would probably like reach into our kind of studio bookshelf and like pull out like a book that's now more than 20 years old and Monacelli published, which you can download from Google Books, which is called Gnostic Architecture. And like I kind of very like a kind of Bible like that came out at the point. Eric Moss being the author of it. And there's one chapter in there that talks about something that I always find very helpful and like probably would be something interesting for you to look at. It's called glue and architecture. Like it talks about how do you to a degree find like connections that go beyond like a certain traditional interpretation of like site or like elements or kit of parts. So when you look at these arches, right, for example, and if you look at what Stephen refers to here as this meandering and kind of developing a very different, very personal site strategy, personal towards the site, but also personal towards you and the program that you promote, you could start to look at those elements and arches and the linearity that you're fascinated by, but start to really investigate and like look deeper how they fit together, how they're glued, what glue and what kind of like touching points there may be. Maybe they're absent because you pull them apart, or maybe they're connected and so tight that they become one. But I think that the way you deal with the site and topography and the way you start to translate it into what your current understanding of architectural elements are, right? Like they're just some sort of different type of brick or element, could be really interesting. So you would go from both that larger like topo to like the really smallness, the smallest DNA of what you architecturally try to do. But like there's also something really interesting in terms of like you know, the way you start to deal with color. I don't know, you're obviously very much at the beginning of your studies, but in certain ways deal with things that I think are going to be with you for quite a while, and I really want to applaud you too. I also like your slide number 3, by the way, the kind of the ball clay type of like cutouts, right? So that's, download this book. It takes like 5 minutes and 60 seconds, like Google Books, Gnostic Architecture. Look at some of the chapters, and like I'm gonna shut up now, but it's great.
I have something to say here. I think it's interesting the 3 project now, the comparison. And I don't think, Stephen, you should be apologetic for the title Transformation of Consciousness, because I can see the project, particularly in this one here and in the first one, that was a reaction. And I think we are in a certain state now, as we know, it's a paradigm shift that's happening overnight, in all kinds of ways. There's a lot of ammunition in the program we've laid out with the Bard Prison Initiative and so forth. I haven't seen any of the project really dealing with that yet. It quickly goes into an art museum, which I find a little bit bizarre. That's okay. I like this project here and the first project in that they both had this sort of semi-irrational approach. And maybe that's also why it's difficult to judge it. But in this case, there was also discussions of time and space. A week ago, I was upstate in New York working on a new project, and I spent 3 hours on a Native American reservation with 2 chiefs and clan mothers and so forth. And it was so interesting to see that they don't live necessarily after our time schedule. One of the ladies was explaining that she's a go-getter. She was a very sharp lady. So I like to get shit done. I'm going to do stuff and this and that. But nobody in the community, in the nation, will do anything. They're just sitting around. But instead, then suddenly, everybody just stands up and walks together. And I think that we are sort of somewhat conflicted in our education and our ways of discussing architecture that is very rational. And we want to sort of judge everything. So even when we talk about the musical references, we need to see it proven. And I think I like the first project in particular because it kind of allowed something that was more sort of disorganized in a sense. There was a different type of human experience that wasn't completely explained.
Couple of points. First, to the issue of the discrepancy between the appearance of the plan and the wiggly journey vis-a-vis the section, which seems to indicate a line to a goal. And this is less a question of how it's drawn and more a question of options. So it's conceivable that they exist simultaneously, which means both options, which would mean you'd include the section and the plan and the section, which gives you a way of touching that wiggly line without following it. So you jump from a wiggle with a straight line to another wiggle. That would be another way to do it. And I associated that, and I think this project is quite different. It originates in an effort to give it some kind of ground or basis or premise for where we're going. And it starts with historic pieces of architecture, which of course are done in social and historical contexts where the form language of the culture is recognizable and shared. And then it jumps to the wasteland, which is not the four quartets, and jumps to the wasteland, which is about fragmented images, and that the culture doesn't have a way. If you look at the original poem, the culture doesn't have a way of synthesizing anything collectively, and that the experience in his case of a land of broken images makes these experiences very personal. And then she goes on to deliver something which is extremely personal, justified in a historical context where we're in a time where it has to be personal because it's not collective. So I think the philosophical premise of the thing is fascinating to me. I think there's Issei is in this thing. Is Issei one of the drawings, that shrine near Kyoto?
Yeah.
Was that? Yeah, that was one of the early ones, which is I think a Taoist shrine or a Shinto shrine.
Shinto, yeah.
And yeah, and I think that the underpinnings, the conceptual underpinnings, are fascinating. I mean, it is at least an attempt to tell us what transformation of consciousness might mean.
I like this number 8, this image up as the interior of your project somehow. I feel like whatever you're doing here, you know, is absolutely original, extraordinary, and I just wish that was the section of the main building instead of the more banal section that you end up with. I think the plan is extraordinary. You know, I mean, when we started this, we said we all had to build on the footprint of the Bayer Blinderbell, you know, visitor center, because that's what they wanted. And immediately Jessica said she wanted to do something else and walk through the woods. And I said, okay, go ahead, let's see what happens. And I think that the plan is absolutely a provocation now for not building on the footprint of the existing visitor center. Why? I mean, take a chance and make the experience, the arrival experience to this building, something about it as well. I think that's you know, that's a key element.
If I could add one quick thing, I agree with all of the comments, and I think it's a beautiful body of study and search, Jessica. I think relative to this question of ground, which we've been talking about in every project, if I could offer one thing that you said, or reflect one thing back to you, you spoke about this sense of gravity and the inhabitants feeling the presence of others, right? And if I remember, there were these early green study models where there was the sense that the structure was actually being suspended, right? As opposed to being propped up. And I think if you go back to those principles of gravity, right, the suspension, I think that sense of being hung down or levitating above the ground, I think would be a lot more powerful in your project, given this question of threshold and transformation. So that, I would say that. And the other thing, very quickly, back to the first question about cutting through that spiral. I think if you actually use the straight cut, it's a representational question, but it's also a conceptual question, because if you use the straight line and you cut, you're going to get all of these breaks, right, where the structure discontinues, and then we see the exterior, we see the landscape. Every single one of those moments is an opportunity. It's a threshold, right? It's a new moment. So all of these beautiful studies that you've been working on in terms of color and light, I think can be more readily discovered in the project if you just cut it in a way that's showing you all of these amazing breaks and episodes that are happening.
It's so interesting, Anthony. There's so many different opinions these days when these students that present to us. Because I would have said the plan and section are absolutely irrelevant. This is a project you developed three-dimensionally, and the section is of very little use. It's a CAT scan, which doesn't really, it's not the tool today we would use to explain the complexity of this project. And it's biomorphic, it's the kind of form we're developing, and that the plan and section are simultaneous when you're seeing three-dimensionally. And the three-dimensional plan allows you to move through it. And I would have said, somebody said it, I would have said the key here in terms of the transformation of consciousness is movement and understanding through the movement of space. It seems like that is her going way back to the river, right? Is that it's a dynamic phenomena, and it had been a 3D problem that had been very clear. And the section is an old tool, and it's just not useful here. It's super, super old school. My opinion. Just
we continue the conversation with
Number 4
with Munjer's project.
Munjer.
Hi everyone. My project is called Searching for the Sublime. It's about a journey towards humility. Next slide. For me, transformation of consciousness for me occurs when there's a journey involved. So going from point A to point B, and for me, going to some of these places such as Arcosanti, Antelope Canyon, Storm King, these places had a profound impact. And when you go to these places, the things you see and the things you experience, you take with you. So as if you're taking a portion of the landscape into your consciousness. Next slide. These are two images, Albert Bierstadt and Frederick Church. And within their images, they're kind of showing this accretion of time and time's effect based on atmosphere. And then in Juhani Palacima's Eyes of the Skin, there was this quote which kind of triggered me, which is like, architecture domesticates limitless space and enables us to inhabit it, but it should likewise domesticate endless time and enable us to inhabit the continuum of time. So next slide. So how can you inhabit continuum of time? The Hudson Valley itself, as you go from Manhattan all the way up to Troy, New York, it's essentially a accretion of time happening. But usually we are on top of this time. It's a journey on history. So how can we access that history? How can we journey through history? Next slide. So I started looking at some rock formation just as a study of how accretion happens, what happens through atmosphere, what happens through erosion, and then considering what if we could inhabit these erosions, these historical timepieces, by doing like geometric cuts from very organic shapes or vice versa. A few cumulative sketches which kind of talk about the subtraction, addition, layering, as well as erosion. And next. And then kind of relating that back to the study of the rocks, how that could happen, kind of like displacement, subtraction, and addition, which inherently is also the history of Hudson Valley, how it was created by this glacial erratic, which was like the displacement of glacial rocks throughout time. Next slide. So here we come at the site. From the right side, you come across through the gravel parking lot into this pathway which begins to dip into the ground and slowly take you through this path which meanders through the forest as well as the two pavilions. The first pavilion that you see on the right houses the Bard College Initiative as well as libraries and some public spaces. And then the second houses all the experimental exhibition spaces as well as this levitating rock formation which you cannot understand if you can inhabit it or not. Next slide. It begins to show you like the subtractions happening from the ground plane. And the idea is that these subtractions would create moments of darkness, lightness, compression, expansion, as well as this transition of the extracted to create new landforms. And then this is the pathway. And as you go through this pathway, you have these moments which are kind of hidden away where you can kind of go in to contemplate or just have these moments to yourself or with other people, with the sky. And then this is just an extended section through that pathway, kind of showing how you embed yourself into the ground, and then have these moments which are open to the sky or much more narrower. Next slide begins to show these two separate pavilions cutting across, and then showing these moments within the landscape. And then the bottom slide showing that cutout through that mass that is kind of precariously just standing there to be explored. Next slide. A few studies kind of like just to see how the building would seem if it was an extraction of sort. And then the next slide, you kind of get to start this moment, this procession from that pathway. So the first one showing you getting depressed into the ground. And then the successive slides kind of showing that pathway, how light is reacting throughout those spaces as you try to get deeper and deeper into the ground. Next slide. As you go deeper, walls around you, the earth itself begins to get taller, and your relationship to the sky begins to either disappear or create alternate relationships with the outside. And then the last, like, these are the three moments that you can kind of come across where you're getting compressed much more. The first image on the left, which kind of shows the super compression, and the blurriness kind of infers the idea that there might be a lot of humidity or a lot of mutedness happening, where the central image is very much open to the sky, but still within the ground. And then the last image, number 10, is very much the deepest we are showing going, and you're kind of seeing the strata that you've unearthed. And then these are a few more images where you're back again on the ground and you're kind of going across on this levitated mass. You cannot tell if you can really go into it, but the fact that you cannot tell makes you want to go and look at it and touch it. And then slowly, if you go to the next slide, you do find an opening, and this is what it could be inside. This experimental space where the ground plane is no longer this like flat, it kind of has these ebbs and flows with volumes which are compressing, almost like as if the pathway that you came through compresses into this one place. That's the last slide.
Mm-hmm.
So one general question for you, since there's quite a history in the discourse of associating natural phenomenon with a conception of building, should I know when I'm walking through your pavilion that the antecedent is a glacier? Is that association germane to the discussion, or isn't it? And if it is, and I understand it's easy to take this premise apart, but of course, when you're talking about glacial, you're talking about time, infinite amounts of time. So the idea that you could recreate time in an elongated sense by doing it instantaneously and replicating it. And the question is, are you doing a disservice to the glacier? Are you misrepresenting the glacier? So that association is worth talking about, quite apart from what it is as a form or a shape or a space or a journey or a material. This is really a discussion about the premise.
I think it's an interesting question. There are moments where you would consider like the displace, because when the displacement happened due to the glacial movement, it essentially displaced the origin of the rock formation to something new. And to me, that triggered the question of, does it have any relevance now because it's no longer in its original spot? So I guess I wouldn't know how to answer your question. I think the fact that now within this site, whatever you're taking out, the ground itself, and kind of placing it in a different position, it's not necessarily sidestepping the idea that it's a glacial mound, but it's just moving it again to create space. I don't know if that.
Well, I don't know. I mean, one possibility would be to excavate the rock. So assuming you could do that, you got a gargantuan chunk of granite that's lifted somewhere and transported somewhere else and then carved, so that it literally belongs to its association. because the question is the question to me is whether that meaning, that association is germane to the content of the project, or you use it as an initiative and then you make what you make and the project is what it is. And if somebody wants to associate geology with it, they're welcome to do it. And if it's of no interest, then you let it go. So it's a means to an end, but it's not an end in and of itself, the transformation of time. That's an open question.
I think it's a gorgeous project. I think it's really beautiful. And I think, yeah, when it begins to operate more in a landscape sense, it gets even more powerful. The more you carve in and don't fabricate things, I think it's even stronger. And I think the plan was, somewhat rigid at times, but I think when you at the end showed the interior images, there's just one moment after the other, which gave a different experience. And I think that was powerful. I was afraid there was going to be this tunnel after tunnel, but like you're showing a whole series of opportunities. And I love the surprise at the end of inhabiting this rock. I think it's choreographed, but I think it's a really beautiful project.
Thank you.
What I was expecting from all the projects, maybe it was a too easy suggestion, was to basically undermine our expectations of the world. And I explained in the lecture that the brain is constantly making predictions and comparing what it receives. And so a way to create a transformation of consciousness would be to undermine the expectation, undermine the prediction. And I think in all of the projects, I've seen an opportunity for that, which could have been exaggerated a little more. In the first case, you talk about sort of tension and release, and I kind of disagree actually with the quote that you said about the more stimulus you give the brain, the more it has to work. I think what creates the release is that the brain is actually still working, it's still making the predictions, but the information isn't there to match it. And so that's what creates the difference. That's what creates the same in music. When you're expecting to hear something and there's a pause, it creates the sensation because your expectation is not matched. And I think that in the second project, that was about inside and outside, which could have been highlighted more. And then the third project, that was also equally with the threshold, right? And I explained how plastic that is, how easily that could be transformed. Our perception of where we begin and end, and interpersonal space, peripersonal space, that can all be played with. And I think in this project, like the other project, and I want to say for Jessica's project, you probably all know about the famous Nagel essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, right? Where he discusses the consciousness of the bat. So I think having to meander and experience the space like maybe a different organism, and then also witness where other organisms might inhabit architecture, invites you to contemplate what it's like to have a different kind of consciousness. Likewise here, I think you are reduced to experiencing the environment on a different scale because you suddenly become aware of your own massive significance and insignificance at the same time. And you have this measure of time in the earth, which becomes very obvious. And then what I like about the way it ends, again, you expect in a building, maybe it's naive, but it's an expectation that the ground is going to be flat. So I would just reiterate that. I would reiterate that don't think that stimulus to brain working is a linear relationship, far from it. The brain is working when you're asleep. The brain is working when you're in sensory deprivation. It's working like crazy to create a world that isn't there. So exploit that and just surprise people. That's where that feeling comes from, because you're expecting a world to unfold in front of you every second. And if something does not meet that expectation, you are going to have a transformation of consciousness, pleasant or unpleasant.
Leah, that's great. That was great. What was what was the book about being a bat?
It's an essay by Thomas Nagel called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And it's quite, I mean, it's not neuroscience, it's very much philosophy, but
because we have a lot of bats up here in Rhinebeck, and when it gets dark, it's amazing. We're sitting out there trying to roast a marshmallow, and there's all these bats flying around.
I didn't know.
I would explain to my 4-year-old daughter that those things only come out at night, and they can't see. They run by radar.
Yeah,
it's very weird.
Navigation is amazing.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Okay. Thanks.
Are we on to the next one now? No.
We still have a few moments.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask, because there's such a split between the language of the last 4 slides, and can we go to the one right before that? And these 4, which I love, you know, because they have this connection to the rock strata. You know, I think about the Palisades. Along the Hudson River, there's this shift of rock strata, the vertical Palisades that are almost like these kinds of striations in the rock. And I don't quite understand the shift between the inner language and this outer language. Is that on purpose?
That's the exploitation that Leah was talking about. That doesn't mean.
Yeah, it's just a contrast essentially. You know, kind of not letting you have everything at once. You kind of have these moments of ups and downs, which kind of.
So it's intentional that going inside of that, you would expect it to look like something else, but it looks like quite a different thing.
Yeah,
it's
intentional.
Different series of spaces. You know, I've been in Terrell's crater, the Rodin crater in Flagstaff, Arizona, and you know, I appreciate everything he's done and that he spent his whole life, you know, doing these incredible axis and light conditions. But it's a little bit predictable, you know. You know, this is not predictable. So I think it in a way plays on what Leah is speaking about changing.
What's interesting about the comment of the bat's brain and surprise would be, what happens when you come to the building the second time? In other words, the meaning of surprise is durable, meaning you have to come in the opposite end the next time, or is this advocacy belong to you come once and then you go away and you never come back? Because enduring
we're out again.
So we're gonna
is adjust and go away. So the question would be, if that's an objective, how would you sustain that?
I think that what endures is actually every time you go revisit, even though you know the initial surprise, which is maybe like the cheap trick, you will have an associative memory that is very strong of that first experience. Secondly, the time you go again, you are a changed person. So like any great work of literature, music, you know now what's coming, but it still evokes an amazing feeling in you because one, you will never forget that first time you experienced it. So that evokes that memory. And then again, as you mature through life, you come that maybe the building doesn't change, but you change. So you're bringing a whole different set of expectations, and you might start to notice something else. Like I say again, we can't take in everything that is available to us. So maybe depending on the context of our mood, what we're coming to the building with that day, that month, that year, that decade, something else, we will notice something else about the experience. You know, like reading Proust or something, we change. But then also the memory of that first ever experience.
But then you put the onus of that, or the responsibility for that, now shifts from the designer to the visitor. So now what you're talking about, if you read the Brothers Karamazov, and it makes an impression of a particular sort, and you return to it, what you bring back to it seems to be the issue that you're raising. And what we were talking about is the capacity of the architect to produce an enduring surprise, or whether that's the architect produces it in the visitor, and then the visitor's job is to sustain it or remake it.
I think, like in the last presentation, the sense of timelessness, if you can create that, that's going to create an everlasting sense of awe. But even in the initial visit, I hold the visitor just as responsible. In every act of art, the perceiver is as responsible. The perceiver is creating their perception of that, whatever it is, even in the first visit.
You know, I have to say, I think that if the project, like I think of my visit in San Sebastian to Chayida's wind comb. The wind comb is absolutely a phenomenal work of environmental sculpture on the edge of the city of San Sebastian, and the waves come and blow through these holes. But when I first saw the wind comb, I thought it was just a sculptural object. But then when I went there, and then the second time I went there, it was different. And the third time it was different. In other words, yeah, I think that, you know, this project interacts with natural light, so it's going to change. It's like, I've been to the Pantheon maybe 30 times, and I never tire of it. It's always surprising to me, the size of the space, the shaft of light. If the rain is coming down, you get these silver sparkles of rain, the cuts that the Romans made in the marble base for drains. I mean, it's, you know, you're always surprised. So I think that the architecture, you know, with the natural light and the procession has that potential. Not that he did it in this one little sketch, but I think he approaches it.
We can get ready.
We have one more
for the last presentation. Alison.
Hello. So I titled my project, "It is easy to hold the earth in your hands, but how do you walk in the sky?" I began by looking at the Hudson River School painters, and they believed that the reflection of the water and studying that reflection was equivalent to one's own internal reflection of consciousness and contemplation. They also used these permanency of geometry, like these trees, to hold the subtlety of light and subtlety of forms. So I began to think about, what does it mean to look at the internal and external reflection through studying inverting, hinging, and mirroring horizons, and also how we can have a simultaneity of transient and stable states through capturing ephemeral within fixed contours. So at the top left, I began by looking at the most general state of land and water and those different typologies, how we can form them. Are they tangent? Are they strung apart? Are they lifted apart? And then also inverting that and looking at figure ground studies of what is the void, what is land, what is form, what is the ephemeral. From there, I began to extrude these forms, and then within those, turning and hinging them on their own internal horizons to see what kind of forms and topologies could come from that. So there's a series of studies. Next, please. Next. And then I actually came up with two different concepts. So scheme A, which is on the left, is looking at a kind of journey from land to sky and water. and how that's pulled apart. So you're constantly moving up from the land, looking up to the sky, and then regrounded, looking up to the sky, and again spiraling upward in this tower at the end that leads you to the sky. And then in scheme B, it's more of a weaving and more ground where they're tangent. So there's sky and water together, woven at the same plane. So in scheme A, again, there's the tower, and in both of them, there's a water element. I wanted to bring in that reflection that I spoke of, that the Hudson River School believed in, and looking at that journey and how the sky and water could reflect with each other. Also within that, on the right-hand side, thinking about oppositions of materials. So, you know, is it darkness versus light, chiaroscuro. So the image on the right-hand side of the section is that journey from the ground, and then we go upward towards the tower, which is a different materiality, different scheme of light. Next, please. And then again, where that water meets the tower, and the building itself kind of extrudes into that with a wall, and how they reflect both the landscape, the water, and the sky, and the building all together as one. And then in scheme B, again, how the relationship is more of a tangent, where the ground and water and sky are on the same plane, and woven through together. In section E, you can see how you cut through just the water elements, and there's this moment where two different parts of the building meet in that one plane of water. So you're looking out into a smaller pavilion. Again, the essence of materiality, how are those inverted and exchanged, mirrored versus, you know, more matte finish? What types of water? Is the water a lens? Is it mist? Is it a wall? And then studying light and shadow, you know, chiaroscuro is how does it fall on a more curved form versus a straight form, and how can those be utilized within these spaces? Next, please. And then going back to George Enos's painting with this geometric form that kind of holds the light, how can I utilize my own geometric forms to hold the ephemeral beings? So these walls that are both transparent and, you know, volumetric, holding the light. I think this is the last slide.
So I just have to say that Allison doesn't have an architecture background. She came directly from painting. And when we had our 50 or so portfolios applying for these 5 positions in the fellowship, she was discarded. And I came to the room and I said, wait.
But yes.
I said, wait a minute, look at these paintings. And they said, well, but she doesn't have an architectural education. I said, but I think that's what this is about, that we're about the fusion of the arts, painting, sculpture, poetry, architecture, landscape, ecology, all these things coming together in our T-Space fellowship every year, you know. And well, I'm just amazed at how she became an architect in 3 weeks.
Well, Stephen, that is so weird. I was going to, first question I was going to ask her, of the group, you got a diverse group. Are you a practitioner? Did you come out of the studio? Because it's clearly the most kind of comprehensive work that goes to material. And I'm going, oh, I've got somebody here that's actually going back and tuning up. Really fascinating. Wow. Totally fascinating. Huh. You've got a lot on board, I've got to tell you. If this is your first project, there's a lot of DNA stuff going on here. Amazing.
Can we go back to the 2 schemes, A and B? You know, she developed her idea about the earth and the sky, and she developed a language directly from her paintings. And then when on Monday, on the 21st, when she showed these 2 schemes, I said, well, you know, why don't you just present them both? I mean, whether it's horizontal, everybody else was said that we can't go above 34 feet because that's the height limit according to the UBC that applies to this site. But I think there's something about this vertical scheme, you know, that connects to her idea, the sky, the earth, and then this carving out place, this dirt that goes back to those paintings. I think there's something really powerful about this vertical scheme.
It really
is fascinating how the argument that you can't teach architecture, or it's entirely personal, or it's self-taught. I mean, there you go.
Yep.
Shadrach Woods or something.
Oh.
That's fascinating.
Oh.
It's spectacular. And it's extremely personal and original. And it comes from something different. Its origins are different. And it works. Somebody put up Yanis Xenakis, I think, Stephen, at the beginning, who's a musician. Did that little pavilion, I think, in Brussels.
Yes, the Phillips Pavilion was done by Xenakis. You know, I met Xenakis at Carnegie Hall. They played one of his pieces that required 140 in the orchestra, and he came, and it was years ago. He came, and I saw him sitting in the front row. So when the piece was finished, I ran down and I said, you know, I'm an architect. I want to shake your hand. I know that you worked for Le Corbusier, and he gave you credit for doing the mullions in the La Tourette. And I was shaking his hand, and he said, I did La Tourette. I know he did the Phillips Pavilion. I know he did the Phillips Pavilion.
Well, he gets credit.
He thinks he did La Tourette.
Yep. Probably not.
Oh.
Really fascinating, Allison. And, you know, I second and third everything that's been said. I can't add much more than that. But I think your command of language is also so precise. You know, the fact that you can find these very fundamental words such as mirroring or hinging or inversion. I mean, these are such powerful tools in which to really help shape a work. And you know, maybe to Leah and Eric and see, you know, the conversation earlier about what, you know, what are the things necessary to sustain one's interest, you know, in a work over time. I think it's a lot to do with very bold, recognizable things, but then it's also to do with a lot of subtleties and underlying layers. So if one finds inversions, for instance, over time, or one finds that there's a reflection that's happening in a story or in a work of art or in a musical composition, you know, elements like that help to keep people interested in something over long periods of time. So I think, you know, you have obviously an incredible gift, and I would hope, you know, that this experience really encourages you and encourages the other 4 members to either continue your pursuit of architecture or begin it. but really, really fascinating and very.
Could we go back to the first images that Allison made when we here? So when we started, we were only three and a half weeks, right? Three weeks. So in the first, I think, Allison, this was the first week, right?
Yeah.
So it was all paintings, which I like, but I thought she'll never make this leap. You know, she's never going to go. I mean, she's a painter. You know, I mean, it's very hard. And then the next image was where? Then
Extrusions.
right, these extrusions that I thought maybe she will. You know, and then the next week was something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But then but there's an in between. We're not seeing the ones
You
that
were not seeing the
no. There was a moment there that I thought, whoa, where's this going? You know, it's really, she's developed a language. And then I said to her, the only trace I could make is the early murals of Michael Graves that before he became an apostate for the Benassaref house. And, you know, I named a few of those early murals that I thought she knew about, but she never heard of him. You know, it's not about the history of architecture. It's coming
but also,
from...
I like that she worked with water, because I feel no one else did that. And you're so close to the river. And I feel like whenever I've been to Wave Hill or anywhere on the Hudson, this kind of, you kind of go down a lawn or something, and then you've got this expansion. And just to be near, I work near the river, and I feel that that helps my thoughts. And maybe it's cheesy to say, but the transformation of consciousness doesn't have to be about the people experiencing the architecture. It can be about the people creating it. And I think if you are making that transformation, we've seen it in the first project. You said he came so far in 4 days, that it often is that some kind of leap of the creator.
That's a spectacular comment. Because in the end, she answered Stephen's admonition about transformation of consciousness, that it might be about the person who's making it, not the person who's going on the journey through what's been made. That's fascinating, albeit conceivably selfish.
You know, I wrote this kind of in the beginning of May, I guess it was, right?
Yeah.
And I changed the nature of what we were going to do because of the whole COVID crisis and everything. I mean, we're in this series, the moment we live in now are a series of overlapping catastrophes, whether it's, and I don't even, you know, everybody knows that there's more than one catastrophe. The war of our government against the environment is one of them. But anyway, so I said this, and then in the first review, when Eric attacked it, I thought, man, it's my fault, you know, because it's such a big thing to try to say. And yet somehow I feel like we're in a kind of moment, you know, we're in a moment that is like a paradigm shift. I mean, we can't just go back to the way it was, right? I don't know. Tom, how do you feel? I mean, it seems to me that there needs to be there will be fundamental paradigm shifts in how we work, because Midtown offices right now are empty. You know, a tower that's supposed to have 8,000 people has 500. You know, the hot dog guy that sold 800 hot dogs a day sold 10. You know, I don't see it going exactly back the way it was. So, and I think architecture is a tool for experience. It's a very important ingredient in what's going to happen in the future. And I think it's very, you know, young people and what we're, you know, what we're hoping for is that they change the world, right, Tom? You used to change the world every morning, right?
Quiet on some of this because I'm just in a different place in my life, and that the notion of the transformation of consciousness is in my current state a bit pretentious for these young people. And I'm much more modest in my own ambitions. And it's also something I see that I'm given by somebody else. It's not my goal. My goal is to produce something that's has a compellingness and a complexity, and that deals with some world between the subconscious and science, and just struggling to figure out kind of where I want to go. And I'm also, at a moment of time, much more interested in very particular operational strategies. And I'm very, I'm not trusting what we consider talent, especially in a pedagogical sense. I'm much more interested in broader operational strategies, which encumber many talents. And again, I don't even feel comfortable in the current academic environment to be able to speak about these projects honestly, because I can't do that in the last 3 decades if we're going to talk talent. And I said to this project immediately that you see somebody that clearly can see very specifically and clearly has an ability to, has a spatial visual intelligence that can quickly absorb and move from one discipline to another, whether it's painting to architecture. Anyway, it's a complicated, and again, yes, can we shape behavior? Yes, is architecture absolutely committed to various levels of exploration and experiment? Can we somehow help people see the world in different terms on multiple levels as we shape behavior both in public realm and the private realm? Of course. And it's, in fact, if anything, we're digging in more so to do that. But again, I'm going to be interested in aspects of this. If we take this project apart, she's got a great future. We could now really kind of go after this project and be useful, because she's going to now enter a point where she has a different discipline, and she's going to somehow internalize and institutionalize some of these ideas. Because I'd go back to the plan again, and she's going to be much more. She arrives here. I'm going to ask you, the author, you've arrived at this. Go back to some of your other stuff.
Right here.
Right here is fine. You've arrived at this somehow. I'm going to use the word intuitively, which is just a very broad notion of just bringing to bear instantaneously what's considered in German, what is it, Fingerspitzengefühle, the combination of kind of instant instincts and intelligence, right, that come out of your fingers, right, the Fingerspitze. I would say now your future is to understand what the fuck is going on here. How did this happen and what is it? And to understand and to control your own abilities. You don't know that yet, which is fine. You should. Maybe it'll take 30 years, by the way. This is a complicated conversation, right? But and now you're going to take this, and that clearly you have instinctual stuff, and you're going to understand where it's coming from, and you're going to, I think, be able to take control of it and give it intentionality. And if you're interested in that, and if you're Eric and I Stephen, we haven't talked about it. I just finished the Last Dance. Have you seen that? Have you seen that?
Did.
Last Dance? On Jordan?
No, I didn't see.
If you're willing, if you're willing now, I'm back to the author, to give it the 10,000 hours, not 10,000, the 50,000 hours that'll get you there. That's the next step, right? That if you actually are interested in this and you're going to commit yourself to this, that you're going to go someplace with this. But now this is just your, I'm getting interested phase. And am I going to kind of commit myself to these kind of interests? Anyway, that's the best I can do, Steve. But it's,
I think.
But because again, we could now. But if we took this thing apart seriously, to me, it'd be positive. That we could take a really serious critique of this and move this thing, move you forward, hopefully, or kind of locate the kind of issues that represent what you're finding the kind of or making it more intentional that allows you to understand your own processes, I guess is what I'd say, which I think is a kind of we could spend more time in the academic world, that we actually, in our teaching, that we actually help you develop a consciousness of your own creative self, right? That isn't intuitive, right? That you have some control over.
But look, Tom, here's the implication of Stephen's question. The world is different. So are we going to run out and make COVID-proof buildings.
Of
In
course
other
not.
words, in
It's
the
not that
broadest,
different anyway. Okay, go ahead.
you know what I mean? And in
Yeah.
the broadest sense, to what extent does the condition of the world, economic, philosophical, historical, sociological, artistic, cultural, to what extent do those conditions, as they come and go, and they do, the vicissitudes of all that stuff, to what extent do they obligate us? And to what extent do we exist in opposition to those things? So that the world would change, and I think Stephen's right, it suggests it's changing radically. If you sold 800 hot dogs and now you sold 8, you know.
Wallace, is your opposition any different today than it was 10 years ago?
792 hot dogs.
But
And
Eric, come on,
not
is your opposition,
Yeah,
is
go
it
ahead.
ramped up at all because of coronavirus in the last decade? Come on.
Say that again?
Has your opposition shifted at all in terms of your stance towards architecture having to do with this?
No, that's what I'm saying. So the point, Stephen, I think, isn't saying yes or no. He's raising an issue that the world takes a jump. Do we jump with it, ignore it, antithetical to it? I think that was the question.
Right, and my personal quote is from Kenneth Rexroth, the poet, who said, "Against the ruin of the world, there's only one response: the creative act." And I think that's what we see in these projects, especially in Allison's. But I believe that creative act is transformative. So, you know, that's why I think today more than ever, music is important, poetry is important, art is important, and architecture. And I agree with Tom. You get a lot of lip service now that they're going to change, architecture because of COVID. This is absurd. I mean, this type of, there were huge New York Times Magazine articles, and I don't want to mention his name, but he's like riding a surfboard over this virus to, get whatever. I mean, it's silly in a way, and also slightly banal. And I think architecture is a much deeper and spiritual thing. And I also love the way that several of these students took a fragment of a poem to take a point of departure. I think that was, the wasteland.
I think is it Leah? Steve, I'm sorry, I don't know her name.
Leah.
But the lady was talking about the bats and all of that. And to me, she hit the key point of the review, which is that the transformative point, and I think this is also yours, is introverted. It's personal.
Right.
That's the one we're interested in. First of all, I think to have a shot at to transform or move someone else, it probably starts in a more introverted way. I think that was her point. I think that's pretty good, which means COVID proof won't be the first issue in the office tomorrow.
Exactly.
I don't know. I tend to agree with Stephen's first, question about a paradigm shift, and I think it's we have all experienced from different standpoint. I was in New York.
Yep.
Did you spend time? No. See, I was here. It's New York City was ground zero on all levels, not just COVID, but protest. Entire Soho was destroyed.
My son lives in Brooklyn. I know. Okay.
On Mercer Street, there is literally like a private army between Canal and Grand Street. And a lot of these guys actually they were former inmates, so they were part of the BBI program. We're not just, COVID is sort of the uninteresting part of it. Of course, we can be designed 6 feet apart and so forth. That's not interesting. It's all the other things. It's the entire protest, it's, devastation of the economy. I think we have to react. And I think what's so intriguing about this last project is the personal aspect. I think, social is a new black. When people start seeing people, out in the street in New York City, there was such excitement, even though you're 6 feet apart, but you're just craving being together. So I think, these sort of formalistic strategies are less and less interesting. And I think what really moves me with this project is I don't think he should sort of get too affected by being, overanalyzing this project. And, you know, I think the force here is.
We lost him again.
Yes, we're down. He'll be back in a few seconds. I don't know what this keeps happening today.
But that's
It's a different standpoint, and I think it's incredibly powerful to see that.
Mhm.
I mean, what's appealing is she's an outsider, literally. That's and that might tell you something about the origin of unusual perspectives. She doesn't belong to you. She doesn't belong to us, not pedagogically. She belongs to something entirely different, and it potentially enormously successful. Stephen, I gotta run.
all right.
Sorry. Thank you so much, and nice to see all of you, and good luck. It's terrific. I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you so
See you
much.
soon. Bye, guys.
For our residents, can you stay on the line for a few more moments, please?
We'll have a post discussion with the residents. Thank you, critics.
Thank you.
Leah, thank you very much. I'm going to go out and get that bat story right away. And,
Right, Leah, we're
thank
all
you
going to be
from
Googling.
Monaco. And Tom, thank you so much for doing this. It was a great day. Really good.
Of course, very nice. Very nice.
And
See you,
Anthony,
man.
great.
Martin,
Great.
Martin, thank you.
Fantastic. Congratulations.
Appreciate it. Thank you for inviting.
Thank you.
Great.
Maybe
Ciao.
Well done, everyone. That's great.
Ciao. Congrats.
Ciao.
Have a great
Thank you.
summer. Keep it up.
Yeah.
Ciao. I go into the water now. Bye.
He's going to jump into the water. There we are.
Okay.
There are the 5 residents.
Well, that was a great day. And, you know, I want to just say that who's ever first in a day like this is going to get the guns unloaded on them. So, Renan, I forgot to warn you about that. Those guys in Los Angeles play hardball, you know. And, we've been doing these juries for years, but it's always like that. When you actually can have like 15 people, and it can be a jury that's going to go on all day, and then the jurors sit down in the front row, and they cross their legs funny, and then somebody tries to present the first project, and boy, it's like a bloodbath. Okay, so that's a typical thing that happens. So don't think twice about it. It's a great project. You know, I thought the Anthony Braxton, you brought that to the table. I thought that was fantastic. And then Franklin also, they weren't finished with their gunshots. They kind of went at you too. So I hope you're okay, because I think you came out of it all right. I think his remark about going into the ground was a pretty interesting remark. I thought also, if you want to work on these projects a little more, because we're going to make a pamphlet architecture out of these projects. The first few pages are going to be about the Montgomery Place and maybe a couple of views of Hudson River School painters and things like that. Then we're going to put images of your schemes, the 5 schemes, and then I think I'll put my crude, not very worked out thing in there, and give it to Leon Botstein and Max Kenner. I think we should. Anyway, I would like to do a pamphlet argument, and Rini will be pulling this together. But we could do it maybe in two weeks from now, or three or four. Let's say 3 weeks from now. Therefore, somebody like Franklin could take another shot at what he heard today, because I thought something about your project and the sketches that Tom was making about going into the section and then connecting across the site more, that could actually change it. I think it could change it. And I think everybody loved Jessica's project. I think starting with the T.S. Eliot was fantastic. But the word that stands out is threshold. So I think that's also something, because it's a delayed threshold. And I thought everything that they said, that needs to be presented better. That long, somehow you've got to make the plan, and maybe you could do a model of just a project. I mean, a 3D model, so that we could read it better. And I think what Anthony Titus was saying about the section, maybe you take a try at cutting that so that we could show it better.
The long section does not replace the short ones, and it's a combination of both maybe that best describes this,
Right.
the story of the project.
And Mungier had also the wrath of Eric Moss. You know, I mean, you know, whether or not the glacier, I mean, come on, the glacier would be embarrassed. What did he say? I mean, come on. That was absurd, you know.
Yeah, I didn't know how to answer that. I was like, I don't.
Oh, who could answer that? I mean, you know, what, you know. Anyway, I mean, you know, it's Eric Moss. He's been around forever. He wants to be provocative and knock you off your chair, and that's his nature. So just take what you need from it. I mean, I thought it was a great project, and I thought people like Anthony realized that, and Martin was very good. He realized that, and Martin Stigsgaard, I thought he was pretty good. I mean, he didn't know about the projects before. He's been up here before. He was at our
I shared with
Rome.
him.
Yeah.
I shared with him some information. He knows about BPI, and
Right.
he's very much involved in the city and the dynamics of the whole
Right.
moment that we're living through.
And then Allison, of course, you got a great, I mean, one of the things about what happened today is I was saying how, you know, fantastic and amazing this was, but it's hard to believe just one person. And I think also these guys are like senior in the wards and the great, you know, things that they've done, Tom Main and Eric Moss, but they just immediately came forward and said a similar thing. So, you know, it's hard to understand what to do next. I mean, you're a painter. Maybe we should have a Zoom about your future, because we could, you know, help somehow, but maybe you want to just remain a painter, you know? Architecture is a difficult world. It is, it's hard. I personally believe that it's one of the most fulfilling once you can build something, if you can, and not a lot of people get to build a lot of things, but still you can have that moment, and then it leaves something for future generations in the way that maybe other art forms don't. But I just, maybe we'll send you the booklet by Alberto Campo Baeza. It's called "So You Want to Be an Architect?" ? And it's to students. I have a copy of that. Maybe we can get another copy of that, and we'll send it to you. You're in Washington, D.C., right?
Yeah.
So
Everybody's addresses.
okay,
yes.
great. Anyway, I think it was a great day. I think we would have a big party, and we would give you.
Yes, but you know what?
What?
I spoke with the office of Anthony Braxton, and he almost came to our review today, but in fact, he was preparing for an event which starts at 5. So in 50 minutes from now, and we're all invited. So I thought that would be a very nice moment to celebrate with
break
Anthony
out
Braxton.
break out a glass of wine on your own, and you know, and enjoy it, and be in touch, because I would really like to do a pamphlet architecture of the record. And I want to correct myself. When Tommy, I think that was interesting how he felt, and I also like the way that it was resisted by Martin Stigsgaard. You know, what does a person do? But I do think that you should look it up. It's on. Kenneth Rexroth is a great poet, and he has wonderful quotes. So if you go on Google, you can find this, but I said it wrong. It's against the ruin of the world, there is only one defense, the creative act. I said the word response or something.
One response, perhaps.
Yeah, that's not right. No, that's not right. I said it wrong, so I need to correct myself. Anyway, I thought this was very creative, and it's amazing we could do this in 3.5 weeks. And well, enjoy the Anthony Braxton